Good morning, Jean.
Morning, Charmaine.
We're, as always, talking about dementia. And actually, today we wanted to talk about a study that's just being released in May, so brand new May time study. And this is really interesting because the title of the study is Associations of Accelerated Biological Aging with Dementia and the Mediation Role of brain structure. So what does that really mean? What the study is really showing, and we'll chat about it in a moment, is that the number one risk factor for dementia is aging. Now, does that surprise you, Jean?
Not at all. That's what everyone will think.
It might seem really obvious, right? It might seem really obvious that dementia is a process of aging. And so at first glance, when you look at the study and it says, talking about aging and dementia, it seems like a really obvious thing. But what is interesting here is that in the study, and this is a big study, by the way, so it was the UK Biobank, they originally had 500,000 participants, and then it ended up being narrowed down to 280,000 people where they had enough data. So they had genetic data on these people, they had a lot of blood data and a whole stack of things. So they were able to follow these people for 13 years. And during that period, 4,770 of these people did unfortunately go on to develop dementia. But what's really interesting in the study is that they're saying the faster you age, the more likely you are to develop dementia. Now, what do I mean by the faster you age is that we have two types of numbers when we think about how people age. So you have your chronological age, which is your birthday you have every year on the same day, and you have your birthday cake and candles, and that adds an additional year to your life. But you also have something called biological age, which is how old your body is rather than your chronological age. And I think you can see this in practice as well, don't you, Jean, sometimes? Yeah, it's interesting. And sometimes you can visually see it. You can look at someone and they look a lot younger than their age, or they look a lot older. But that's not always the best way because, I guess sun exposure and things, sometimes people can look a little older but there are ways you can measure biological age. There are quite sophisticated clocks that have been developed now called epigenetic aging clocks. But actually, what they did in this study was they used fairly simple markers like blood glucose and inflammatory markers. And they also looked at how, when you breathe out, how forcefully you can push air out of your lungs. So they looked at quite sort of simple things. And from that, they were able to sort of calculate the person's biological age. And then from that, they could determine your risk for developing dementia. So why this is important is because a lot of those markers that they measure, like insulin, and actually they didn't even measure insulin in here, it was glucose, but blood glucose and your inflammatory markers and things like that actually are modifiable. So what does that mean, modifiable? Exactly. Exactly. Absolutely. What's interesting is I'm putting together my presentation for our first talk where we talk about risk factors. And so I'm talking about modifiable lifestyle factors. So modifiable means these are things you can actually change, right? You have some control over them. And interestingly enough, when I'm talking about those, I have also included genetics under modifiable factors. And it is interesting because people will go, well, I can't change my genes. I was born with the genes, or I have the gene for Alzheimer's, or that sort of thing. But actually, what we do know now is that through this concept of epigenetics, so what that means is that yes, you can never change your DNA. You're born with the genetics that you were gifted at birth, and you will die with those genetics as well. But our genetics switch on, our genes switch on and switch off in response to our environment. And so even if you do have the gene for Alzheimer's, what we now know is that those genes actually only switch on when the environment creates a situation where they have to. And what we know about Alzheimer's is the production of things like amyloid is actually the brain's way to protect itself from insults, from inflammation and things like that. So if you change the environment, those genes that produce that effect of amyloid don't necessarily have to switch on. And we know now that some studies say 50%, but there are actually some that say up to 80% of dementia can be prevented through changing these factors. Yeah. Mhm. Yeah. Mm. Yeah, it's interesting, and I do a lot of epigenetic testing in my practice, where we look at so not just the genes but how they are expressing. I do a lot of biological age testing as well, and what is really interesting is that exercise is one of the biggest levers in reducing your biological clock. So you can actually shave some years off your biological clock with exercise. So it is quite a powerful way of doing that as well. Um, yeah, yes, absolutely. So lots of interesting things. Oh, and another thing, just coming back to genetics as well, is it's still worth testing. So people used to say, "Well, I don't want to test because I don't want to know if there's nothing you can do to change it." And we're like, "Okay, wait, now we know we can change it." But it's still worth testing because if you know where your genetic weaknesses are. Say, for instance, you've got a difficulty with the uptake and transport of vitamin B12, which is a very crucial nutrient for brain health, then that's one area you need to focus on. You need to put more energy and attention and things into that. So, or you have issues around MTHFR, and then you know you need more folate, or so it is still definitely worth doing the genetics. But absolutely, you know, there are some simple biomarkers that are so easily available, and that are definitely worth working with. Mm. That's a good point. Yeah, it's a good point you make as well, and it is important. Well, for me, why I like testing rather than guessing, because it's easy to say, okay, you know, just eat well, sleep well, exercise, do all these things, and of course these things do matter. But when you test, you can also get very specific. You kind of know these are my kind of weaker areas that I need to work a little extra on. So it does make it so much more personalized. Mm, exactly. Exactly.